Hey guys, talk a little bit about skeptical criticism and why I think it's absolutely necessary. Studying the stuff I've been studying lately, and I'm not really going into a lot of details on the specifics of it all. I've had to look at skeptical criticism, and the reason I've come to think that it is probably the only way to approach this topic from a modern perspective is that the stakes of it all. You know, every group out there, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, um, all the proselytizing faiths, your whole afterlife, if you know, whatever term you want to use, is completely dependent on this. And you look into a lot of these topics, and one thing I've learned to do is to read each writer individually and quit trying to force them all together. And I think that's something that Christians do all the time is they force it together. They force it to make sense. And quite frankly, there are some things that are inconsistent between these books. I think it's abundantly clear that Paul, James, and Peter, and Barnabas, even for that matter, were not on the same page. There was a conflict there. And I think it is pure fiction to think that if you got them all in a room together, that they would just say, ah, that's right, James. I wish I would have worded it that way. That's exactly what I believe. And that's, back to this topic of skeptical criticism. It's the only way to deal with all these theologies. It's the only way. And looking into a lot of these arguments and stuff, Christian apologists on a regular basis are getting their butts handed to them. Some of these excuses, and that's exactly what some of these arguments are so question begging and stretching from one thing to the other that they literally cease to make sense at a certain point. And in the stuff that I'm reading now, I think there is a case to be made for an alternate history, a different version of everything that happened to Jesus and his apostles. Everything from the apostle model, the apostoloi. That is a different system from anything known in Judaism, and I don't think shaliach covers a discipleship system. It's actually something that lines up with the Essene understanding. And these issues need to be resolved, I think, for anyone to even begin to address the facts. And I think if you approach everything um, skeptically, and that's really what I come to believe, because if you stop to think about it, you look at the church, right? And this is why I do have a suspect bone about this canon. Every doctrine that those guys came up with, the Trinity eventually, the deity of Christ, the oneness belief that seems to be slightly before the Trinity, the pre existent Jesus belief. These were all things floating around in the church. And as the church constricted, it choked out these other beliefs. But every doctrine that they have settled on, from Calvinism to original sin to Trinity, I reject every one of them. And if you are a Unitarian, you already have to understand you're engaged in skeptical criticism. You already are. And I think skeptical criticism is a title apologists have come up with to hang around the necks of people who seem, for the most part, to have facts. I've been having these little comment wars the last couple of days, and I don't want to lie, it was two or three separate people in these long-running threads said, why would you listen to someone like Bart Ehrman? A Christian has no business listening to someone like Bart Ehrman. The blindness of people, it's beyond my comprehension. You know what I mean? I cannot even begin to comprehend the way people reject common sense truths. But when it comes to the canon itself, it seems to fall in that same line, though. It is a logical question to ask. If they are sitting there telling you what to believe, is it outside the realm of possibility to say that maybe they gave you certain books and translations to help form that belief? I mean, it's just a bare fact. We already know the image of James and Josephus and John the Baptist and Josephus and the Dead Sea Scrolls, if in fact we can establish that link between the two, doesn't resemble the James that you find in the Bible. And it's just a crushing question that has to be asked and made to be understood. What is actually going on? And for some reason, when you start getting into this issue of the canon, people get very nervous. Well, and they always like to say, well, you know, did God have anything to do with forming the canon? Well, do we have free will or not? And it seems to me whenever people that believe in free will, I mean, the Calvinists, I already know the answer, but it seems that people that believe in free will are quick to annihilate that doctrine for the sake of preserving their understanding of something. And, you know, as I was really cranking the screws on this, trying to get down to the root truth of all these different things, to me, it's been more enlightening than anything. But I would, you know, just simply ask you, if you think that the Roman Church, the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon, and you think her daughters are the Protestant Church, I mean, really think about what you're saying. Protestantism really didn't fall that far from the Catholic tree. It really didn't. Martin Luther continually acknowledged the authority of the Pope. He was going to throw out the Epistle of James because he knew what it said, okay? And the only reason it stayed in there is because of pressure from people around him. And I think he was going to toss Jude too. It was more than just James, but James saw something in that book that apparently you don't see. I see it. I definitely do. And I accept it. And I accept that it draws a distinction between other understandings we have in the Bible. And that's my point in this video. Is these things, if you're going to tell me that my soul and you know, whatever belief it is, and they all have this in common, the Trinity, the oneness Pentecostal doctrine, Jehovah's Witness, futurists, preterists, historicists, all these views must be held under skeptical criticism. They must be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. And you really can't do that with these doctrines because there's so many holes in a lot of them that they just don't make sense. They literally fall apart under common sense questions. And see, that's the thing. To disprove these doctrines doesn't take a crazy, stretched out, weirdo theology. And what I've noticed is it seems to come from all the lens. It comes from the lens that you're looking at things. You know, with the Trinity, It's simple questions. Why do you go to passages, and this is why I've encountered in the last couple of days. Why do you always go to passages that have nothing to do with teaching who God is? Instead, it's a riddle that's buried in another passage that actually doesn't have anything to do with any kind of teaching. But when I go to the Shema, I go to Isaiah 44. You can even look at John 17. You go to these passages, and you go to epistles of Paul, and you'll say the same thing. Anytime they're talking about the personhood of God, it turns out to be the Father. Common sense question, and when you break it down, it really just obliterates any kind of, same thing with oneness. It's simple. Why do we have two people talking to each other? It's a question a 5-year-old can ask, and it only would take a fully grown, damaged, brainwashed adult to completely take that simple question and pontificate ideas that are so far out of the realm of possibility, to make sense of it and destroy human language and logic and comprehension at a fundamental level to try to prove these doctrines. He bounced over to the formerly hot topic of preterism. What happens there? You ask some simple questions. Why is Paul not, why is it a big deal that you shouldn't get married if it's all spiritual and the world's going to go on anyway? It just doesn't make any sense. Why do, and it's like the Old Testament has cooties or something. You can't even make sense of Ezekiel. You literally can't do it. And so what do people do? People arbitrarily start planting flags everywhere, and they say, well, only the words of Jesus matter. Well, unfortunately for people who take that stance, and I'm going to tell you, I think it is a dangerous stance. And what that person will do now, instead of actually dealing with the statements, they're just going to say, oh, don't think I've noticed you're quick to discount Jesus. It's not that at all. It's that the words that are attributed to Jesus have to line up with the scriptures that came before him. If he's going to tell me to search the scriptures to find him, and then I find things that are quoted improperly, quoted out of context, that's a dangerous game to play, because now you just have a loaded theological gun sitting in a room with a bunch of 5-year-olds. Okay, some of these things these apologists say for all of these things that I've mentioned, from the Trinity to the preterist topic, on their face they're just so absurd that they boggle the mind, and they all come down to this simple thing. It's just planting your flag somewhere. And what you're going to find is, when you investigate, why is that flag planted right there? Why there? Why the words of Jesus? Why not fulfilled prophecies of the Old Testament then? But when you start looking at it, you find out it's usually just to prove a point. Wherever this flag is, it's that it lines up perfectly with their point. And, on a side related note, it seems that the first book written on preterism and theology, it seems that the early ones in the 1800s that started using this theology turned out to be universalist. And it's a curious thing, but I guess it's a logical conclusion if you're going to chase that down to the end of Revelation and hell and death and all that's done away with. I guess it does make sense in that regard. But staying on topic is planting flags. If you're going to plant a flag, you better know why. That's what I'm saying. And another one of these flags is the canon. And I'm thinking to myself that people that run these circles, if you are a Unitarian, if you're someone that I've maybe interacted with, or you've seen my videos before and you're in a normal circle, you know who I'm talking about. You've already rejected every single thing that's come out of the church. Jesus didn't start a church. The total abuse of the word ecclesia. He didn't start this system. He said you had one teacher. Do you have one teacher or don't you? If Jesus is alive, like you claim, then why, what other teacher do you have? So there's literally a lot of things that don't make sense. But if you watch these videos, you've rejected everything already. probably rejected original sin. If you're Unitarian, you've rejected the deity of Christ, the Trinity, the pre-existent belief, Calvinism. I mean, I could rattle these things off when Theotokos, Mother of God thing, um, the Immaculate Conception. Some is also the virgin birth separately. They're not the same thing. Immaculate Conception is Mary. The perpetual virginity of Mary, indulgences. Um, you've rejected Martin Luther's point of view that James shouldn't be there. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And you know, literally what you're left with at the end of the day is this feigned argument of apostolic authority. You've already rejected that because obviously if you thought there was a lineage of apostolic authority, you would be a Catholic. I've just gotten to the point where I really don't see a point to Protestantism. I don't. I don't even see a point. Christianity was not what the movement was. It just means messianist. That's what it means. And they think it's like, oh, I'm Christ-like. No, it means you're a follower of a Messiah, messianist. And the last one you're left with is the canon. And the more you look into this issue, the only ones who have these really big chest-thumping answers are the evangelicals. And they're built on very shaky ground. They're built on presuppositions. And they don't even acknowledge the obvious facts. There are places in the scripture where, and like I said, I think all of the gospels were written after 70. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind about that. And I'm hoping, me and Sir Williams were having a discussion the other day. He brought up a concept, a topic about Matthew 24. And, thinking about it now, if you're going to say the disciples didn't know that he was going to be crucified and come back to life, if they didn't know, then there's no way they could be asking him about his second coming. And I thought, what a devastatingly simple argument. But it's true. Like, pick up your cross and follow me. Well, if he wasn't teaching that and no one understood it, then what does that mean to them? Really? I mean, think about these things. And I'm going to point out just one example. I think that skeptical criticism actually, it punches a massive hole in some of these non-common sense arguments. And what I'm saying is, and this isn't, just to clarify, this has not damaged my faith at all, looking at it this way. And you may not be comfortable doing it this way, and that's fine. I'm not proposing that you have to do it. What I'm saying is that operating under these traditional assumptions is exactly that. It's operating under assumptions. There really isn't a good argument for the canon at the end of the day. It's changed as late as the 1800s, depending on which Bible you read. So the canon has long been the most, sola scriptura has been the most important thing. And at the same time, it's also dismissed like that. Like that. How can sola scriptura be true and then you toss books out of the Bible? Doesn't make any sense. The fact of the matter is, books like Enoch, Tobit, Jasher, whether it's the oral teachings or the actual books, okay, I'm not going to even get stuck on that argument. What I'm going to say is there are teachings mentioned from outside of the Bible. That's a fact. And maybe that's why it happened that way. Maybe that knowledge is there for people who are willing to go and find it. I don't know. I'm not making an assumption about anyone's character. Even the term Son of Man. You know where all these Protestant evangelicals go? Not Ezekiel. No. Not Daniel, maybe. A lot of these guys go to Enoch. The Son of Man. That's the title from the book of Enoch. I thought it was sola scriptura. Why? You see what I'm saying? It just literally doesn't make any sense. It's just a bunch of people quote mining things to make their theologies hold true. But I want to talk about something in my view, the non-canonical, and this joke here, like I said, I still see people making videos about John. And, it's supposed to be this book that everyone will pretty much agree he never said it. I had a debate, if you want to call it that, with a guy on the phone a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about, what do you mean there's no parables? Jesus says, I am the door. That's not a parable. And he couldn't understand that. I mean, he literally couldn't understand that. It's a metaphor. It's not even close to being the same thing in the slightest. So what I whatever. But people are still doing it to this day. Making the videos, and there are many rooms. I'll come back and get you. Conversation with Nicodemus, all this stuff. It never happened. I'm very confident in saying that. The syntax, the grammar Jesus uses is just completely foreign to what someone in the vein of normative Judaism. I know there are people out there who think that normative Judaism didn't exist. I disagree. I think it did exist. And if any example would be, if you're going to believe Jesus is the Messiah, he would be the definition of normative Judaism. And given the fact that he argued with the Pharisees, and he argued with them, not about the Torah, not about its validity. He argued with them about the way they apply it and the way that they are hypocrites to people. So I would assume Phariseeism, for the most part, is a form of normative Judaism. Is there such a thing as a perfect normative Judaism? I don't know. But when you look at the Sadducees, who were priests that were appointed by Rome, a lot of people, I didn't know that, really. I was unclear on that. And some of these people were Gentiles. The high priest sometimes was a Gentile. And now you know why. When they took the temple, the first thing they did was kill the high priests in retaliation for killing James. So, I still see people building theology off of John. And that just strikes me as dishonest and completely useless. If at the end of the day, it's just going to come down to some statements said in the Gospel of John, and we all agree he never said them, like the I am statement. Some people think those mean nothing, and I've really come to the belief, paying careful attention, especially the last one in the Garden of Gethsemane, where it says I am and people fall down. Like I pointed out in a previous video, the Trinity Delusion had made a video about the Gospel of John, and like I said, I'm not in this. I'm not judging. I'm not calling. I'm not judging anybody. That's not my place. I would just say I respectfully disagree. But that comment thread, the I am statement in the garden comes up, and I'm not lying. It was like 20 to 30 comments, and they're all arguing over this like it actually happened. Again, it's people will readily admit it didn't happen, yet everything is literal. And to me, that is talking out of both sides of your mouth. I'll just say that. And I know a lot of people, they just don't have a problem with people putting words in Jesus' mouth. I have a monstrous problem with that. If you're going to follow the words of your teacher and you're reading something that's not his words, but someone else's interpretation of his life and what he did, it should not be portrayed as a gospel, and yet it is. It's impossible Jesus used the vocabulary that he did in the Gospel of John. It comes from a different, well, I'll put it this way. Either synoptics are completely wrong or John is completely wrong. It's one or the other. But I do find Jesus much more believable as a Pharisaical sounding Jewish person who kept the Torah. And forget the Torah is the Torah, okay? The covenant, the 10 Commandments, plus the laws for inheriting the land. But if we just stick with the 10 Commandments, at the minimum, that's the nomos, that's the Torah, okay? And that was given by God. No one's got a right to come and change that, knock that down. No, yeah, and that would include Jesus. It would not make any sense for the Jewish Messiah to come and annihilate the Jewish laws that were given by God for righteousness and holiness. If you read the Psalms, and what is it, Psalm 119, or the entire book of Psalms is all about God and his laws and his teachings and how they're so wonderful, and he calls them delicious. I'm not buying that argument that the Torah was wiped out by Jesus. It's really starting not to make sense that the Jewish Messiah destroyed everything Jewish at the end of the day. And where does this teaching come from? Ultimately, it comes from the canon that you inherited from the church, who gave you all these other doctrines which you already reject. So You know, to me, I have reached a conclusion that the Torah will always be in place. Where do Gentiles fit into the Torah? That's a discussion that I still am working on. But I have reached a conclusion based on Jesus' own words. His own words. You won't find his own words destroying the Torah. So it's just the opposite. If you break the least of these, if you teach someone to break the least of these, um, what must I do to be saved? Keep the law, the Torah. I don't even like calling it the law anymore because I have developed a very appreciative understanding of what the Torah is. It's not just the law. It's a lot more than that. It's a way of life. But he says, keep the Torah. And the guy says, I've done that. Good. Now that you've done that, come follow me. Sell your stuff and come with me. So you see, the two are related. It seems Jesus taught obedience. And that's one thing that's really, really hitting me hard right now is the obedience. And then the question is, obedience to what? The only thing he taught obedience to was God through the Torah. I cannot find anywhere else where he nullifies that and says it's going to be toast after the crucifixion. Nothing like that. Nothing along those lines. But to point out something in skeptical criticism, that these are the little clues that you can find when you're open about it. Let me just say that, when you're open about it. You go to John chapter 11, and in verses 38 through 44, you have the resurrection of Lazarus. And pay careful attention to this, okay? This is something that helps you prove that this was written after 70 AD, okay? If you go to verse 45, it says, many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and Pharisees gathered to the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place, the temple, and its authority, and our nation. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. Now, if you're going to ask me if I believe that man said that, if he was sitting there saying, wow, if this Jesus goes on remember, raising Lazarus is what pushed them over the edge. So in their own mind, they believe somehow this guy raised a man from the dead or was a charlatan. But the thing that strikes him to say is that we're going to lose our nation and our temple if he goes on. Way too precise. It's not, you know what I mean? This was what happens when they throw him out the synagogues between 80 and 90, give or take. And the guys, they wrote this book to blame, okay? And that's what they do right here. They insert this to make them the reason that they lost the nation. It's a spiritual middle finger to them is what that is. There's no way you're going to convince me that man sat there and said that they're going to take away the temple and our nation behind this dude Jesus. Was he a prophet now too? Is that what's going on? Someone who's not in step with God? It literally doesn't make any sense to have this guy saying this unless it was after the fact. And so they put this conversation in there to make the Jews even more guilty, which is the whole book of John. That's what it's about. Whoever wrote this, they were bitter. They were bitter. They got thrown out of the synagogues. And this is a polemic. The whole thing's a polemic against the Jewish way of life, the Torah, the Jews. You know, you got Jews talking just like Pilate, calling them the Jews. You know what I mean? It's just not very believable. Let me put it to you that way. And you can believe it if you want. Okay, don't get me wrong. But what I'm saying is, I think in all honesty, when you really start asking these tough questions, Remember, you got to put them yourselves in their shoes. What would they have understood? What would they have known? Caiaphas would have had no way of knowing that the entire nation of Israel was going to be crushed under the steamroll of Titus, or the destruction of the. He had no clue. There's no way, personally, you're going to convince me that this man sat there and knew that. This is somebody getting even with them. Um, and you know, to me, it's just not about drinking the Kool-Aid anymore. It's really digging down deep and not being afraid of what lies underneath. And what I'm finding, to me, is actually very rewarding. And it's almost like shedding shackles. You know what I mean? There's many things to consider in the scripture, and I'm sure I'll never figure all of it out. But you know, the lesson of the Bible is obedience. And the question is, obedience to what? And the canon was selected by people who wanted you to think a certain thing, and I think everyone would agree with that. Would anyone disagree with that? Would anyone say, well, the only thing that was on the church fathers' minds between 350 and 400 was just getting the God's honest truth out there? I don't think so, and I don't see any reason now to turn that off at the canon. The canon is like this holy cow, the sola scriptura argument that is a bastion for a certain way of thinking, but there, to me, is just no reason to say that's the case. I don't see any reasons given from God to think that's the case. It seems like these people had an agenda.
Is the new model, the new concentration camp, where the camp has been built by the inmates themselves, and the inmates are the guards, and they have this pride in this thing they built. They've built their own prison, and so they exist in a state of schizophrenia where they are both guards and prisoners, and as a result, they no longer have, having been lobotomized, the capacity to leave the prison they've made or to even see it as a prison. And then he went into his pocket and he took out a seed for a tree, and he said, "This is a pine tree." He put it in my hand and he said, "Escape before it's too late." See, actually, for 2 or 3 years now, Chiquita and I have had this very unpleasant feeling that we really should get out. That we really should feel like Jews in Germany in the late 30s. Get out of here. Of course, the problem is where to go, because it seems quite obvious that the whole world is going in the same